Scott Eastwood built his life the hard way. Brick by brick, deal by deal, loyalty by loyalty. Atlanta had become his home, a city where skyscrapers gleamed like promises and the construction world rewarded only the toughest. His best friend since childhood, Jim Harper, had been by his side through every stage of the grind. Their construction engineering company was thriving, their marriages stable, their futures bright. Scott believed he had everything a man could want. Beside him was his wife, Sydney Sweeney, ambitious, magnetic, adored by everyone who crossed her path. What Scott didn't know was that this beautiful life had already begun to rot from the inside, and the betrayal growing in the shadows was closer than he could ever imagine. Sydney Sweeney was a rising tech executive in Midtown Atlanta, constantly surrounded by success, temptation, and ego. Scott trusted her, even admired how quickly she climbed corporate ladders. But something subtle began to shift: late nights, sudden canceled plans, secrecy disguised as stress. Scott brushed it off. After all, they'd survived long-distance college years and career storms. But then Gary Mellows, a disgraced business owner from a rival company, approached Scott with a folder filled with photographs. Photos that showed Sydney and Jim walking hand in hand into a Buckhead motel, another showing them in intimate moments. At first, Scott dismissed it as sabotage, but deep inside, something cold began to settle. Something that whispered, this might be real. Scott refused to rely solely on the word of a man like Gary Mellows. Instead, he hired a private investigator, one of Atlanta's sharpest. Over the next 2 weeks, he learned that every Wednesday, while Scott believed Jim was on-site supervising operations, Jim was instead sneaking into the comfort and off Melrose Drive. Sydney appeared minutes later. The investigator captured timestamps, footage, and undeniable evidence. That Wednesday morning felt like a slow-motion nightmare as Scott stood outside room 128, leaning against his truck, waiting for the two people he loved most to walk out together. When the door finally opened and Sydney's eyes met his, the truth shattered their world. Sydney froze, guilt painting her pale. Jim lifted his hands defensively, stuttering excuses Scott never bothered to hear. Scott didn't shout, didn't rage. "You're both not worth my time," he said before turning away. But his silence cut deeper than any outburst. Sydney begged for a chance to explain, but Scott walked back to his car, drove away, and let the weight of 20 years of friendship collapse behind him. Later, a court officer delivered papers, a restraining order, notifications of dissolved partnership documents, and notices of property seizure. Scott had moved with surgical precision. He wasn't just walking away. He was dismantling everything they had betrayed. Before confronting them, Scott had already set his plan into motion. He sold a share of the company to Gary Mellows, but not at full price. Official documents reflected a reduced value, while the majority of the funds were hidden through offshore accounts. Now Sydney would only receive half of the visible sale value in the divorce settlement. Jim, who had been so certain he and Sydney could keep their affair secret, never imagined he would lose both the company and the friendship that shaped his life. Scott wasn't just hurt. He was calculating, quiet, methodical. Revenge wasn't loud. It was strategic. With the locks changed and bank accounts drained, Sydney was shut out of the home she once ruled. Court orders required Scott to allow her supervised access, but he made sure every visit was humiliatingly procedural. When she asked for her possessions, he told her he had donated everything to Goodwill. It wasn't true, but the emotional blow was the point. Still, Sydney fought back tears and tried to repair what was broken. "I still love you," she whispered one night. "We can fix this." Scott stared at her with a coldness that made her step back. "You loved cheating more than you loved me," he said. "And I don't forget betrayal." Jim tried repeatedly to justify himself. He claimed Sydney seduced him. He claimed he was emotionally fragile. He claimed it was just physical. Scott knocked him unconscious after one heated confrontation and dragged him out of the house like a sack of trash. Meanwhile, his business life fell apart under Gary Mellows' silent sabotage. Orders delayed, equipment withheld, deals blown. Gary's revenge was brutal, and Jim had no idea he was being crushed from both sides. Eventually, he lost everything: money, marriage, home, and reputation. The man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Scott was reduced to nothing but regret. Sydney's world started collapsing next. Her company placed her on probation after a scandal involving leaked images. Intimate motel footage Scott had quietly slipped onto adult websites. Her name, contact information, and professional details were all attached. The internet never forgets. Sydney sobbed when she discovered it. She called Scott nearly 30 times in one day. Every call went unanswered. She filed police reports, but the digital fingerprints were untraceable. She began to realize that losing Scott wasn't her biggest punishment. Living with what she had done was. And the world was now watching her fall. The divorce proceedings were ruthless. Sydney tried to present herself as a victim of emotional abandonment and manipulation. But Scott's lawyer dismantled her defense effortlessly, presenting evidence, timelines, footage, and testimony from investigators. Sydney cried in the courtroom, pleading for reconciliation, begging the judge to consider their deep history. Scott never once looked at her. In the end, she lost half the value she thought existed, because Scott's offshore arrangements were untouchable. She walked away with far less than she imagined, and far less than she needed to rebuild her life. As Sydney and Jim lived the consequences of their choices, Scott rebuilt himself. He secured a new engineering contract in San Diego. Gary Mellows, impressed by Scott's brilliance and strategic thinking, handed the remainder of the company back for far less than he paid. Scott, alongside loyal colleague Maria, launched a new era of success. With financial freedom, business stability, and a future far away from betrayal, Scott found peace. But peace didn't erase the memory of what had happened. It only strengthened his resolve to never be a victim again. When Scott finally released the intimate footage of Sydney and Jim online, on 10 different platforms, it wasn't out of rage. It was a calculated closure. Sydney's digital shame spread quickly, overshadowing her corporate accomplishments. Meanwhile, Jim attempted to rekindle something with her, but Sydney had filed a restraining order against him. Their affair had not only destroyed Scott's marriage, it destroyed their own lives too. Scott watched their downfall from a distance with no satisfaction, merely a cold understanding. Some betrayals deserve consequences. Standing on his balcony overlooking the skyline of a new city, Scott realized he had rebuilt more than a career. He had reclaimed himself. He thought back on Sydney's tears, Jim's excuses, and everything he had lost. But he also recognized everything he had gained: wisdom, strength, control, and freedom. Atlanta had shown him the darkest truths about loyalty. San Diego offered him a new beginning. And as he turned toward the horizon, Scott Eastwood took his next step, a step unburdened by betrayal, armed with the knowledge that the good guy doesn't always finish last, not when he's smart enough to rewrite the ending. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories. Have a good one.